we were talking earlier about, and you wrote about this in your article, with the sacrifice of Isaac, right? This really like pivotal moment in the Old Testament where you have God telling Abraham to take his one and only son and go up to the mountain and sacrifice him. And it's kind of it's a story that we read and we feel sick at first because we're like, why would God ask him to do that? And Abraham seems so quick to be like, okay, like,
yeah.
One of the interesting things in that whole story is how silent Abraham is throughout the whole thing. Doesn't really ever push back. And you have this moment here where Abraham is about to kill his son, and God steps in and tells him, no, you don't need to do this. And then he does provide, in the bush, there's a goat there for him to then sacrifice instead. And so that's where we get some of this idea here of a substitute, right? Instead of him killing his son, a goat is there. But what some scholars have pointed out, and I think this is the interesting piece to our conversation here, is that there's one interpretation of this, of God revealing that I will provide substitutionary things so that you don't need to kill, your sons. And I think that is an element there. But I think something that's missed that you talked a little bit about in your article and that we've gone back with is that God seems to be showing Abraham that these are the sacrifices I don't want. Like, I don't want you to be sacrificing other humans. And I don't want to see that happen, because that was a common practice of the day. And probably why Abraham wasn't so shocked by God's request is that's what the gods did in the ancient Near East was tell you to go and sacrifice your one and only son, I don't know. Anything else from your article that you felt like added to that?
So I use a term, and it's in the title, the doctrine of accommodation, just to define that. It is a practice. It's a Hebrew reading of scripture practice that is mostly pointed to in the early church, first and foremost by Augustine. Augustine's a mixed bag. There's a lot of stuff he brings to the table. Some of what he wrote in the book on Christian doctrine, that first book specifically, super helpful for me. So Augustine, and then there's other things about how he writes about violence and the place of war now in an empire that Christianity is behind, that I'm like fully disagree with. Some of how he talks about sin and sin condition, I believe is his own shame and struggle from his party life, being placed on, trying to figure it all out. And so I think he's a mixed bag, but he uses a term, doctrine of accommodation, which, like I said, is a practice of understanding. And what the doctrine of accommodation is it is saying that we have this God that is beyond what we can understand. And what he does is he meets us in a way that we as humans with minds that are just, we can't fully comprehend God, he finds ways to connect with us in ways that we can comprehend. And so in the Old Testament, what we're seeing is him doing this. And so the covenantal system, when he uses covenant with Noah, with Abraham, with David, with Moses, even some of the language that's used in scripture back in the garden, when he uses these means, they would have already understood this because it's a practice of relationship that they already use. And so God is saying, you already use that system and that practice. I'm going to use it as well to meet with you, to bring your heart to a place where you understand me and ultimately turn you towards Jesus. The sacrificial system is also one of those systems. So their sacrificial system in their cultures there, I mean, they already practice it. So with Abraham having a deity asking for a human sacrifice was not out of the picture. Yeah. And so the reason why you don't see pushback in the text, the reason why you don't see him arguing about it and it being this struggle, is that Abraham, it's just not out of the norm for them to believe that a deity is asking them to sacrifice a human being, a family member, a son. And what I believe is happening here, like you said, and you alluded to, is that God is inviting him in. And after that substitute comes, if we want to talk about that, God never asks for human sacrifice again. I believe that it's at that moment he actually turns us to say that this is a practice that he does not want.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I want to point to, and I talk about this in my article, Jesus does this with Peter and the disciples. Jesus teaches about enemy love. He teaches about turning the other cheek. And there's this moment in Luke 22 where he talks to his disciples and he asks them to go buy a sword. And they say, we have two. And he says, that is enough. And so Jesus is asking them to actually bring a sword in the garden where he's about to be arrested. And you think to yourself, why? Like, is he going to fight off the people who are arresting him? And what we see, if you see the text, Peter cuts off with the sword, he cuts off the ear of one of the soldiers, and Jesus heals him. And what does he do? He says, he who lives by the sword dies by it, right? And at that moment, and we quoted this in the last episode, Tertullian says, when Jesus disarmed Peter, he disarmed all Christians of the sword. And so what I believe in similar fashion, just like Jesus asked him to bring a sword so that he could disarm him, I think that what's happening is that God is asking Abraham to bind Isaac, to sacrifice him so that he could disarm him in that moment.
Yeah.
And never ask. It'll never be, human sacrifice will never be asked of again, and it will never be a part of Yahweh's relationship with his people and the worship system ever again.
Yeah.